Welcome to the DRS Train podcast. This service is the convoluted ranking of the F1 World Drivers' Champions Part 2. I'm your driver, Peter Brook, and your conductors today are Nav F1 and returning guest DanNoSkill. Welcome, guys.
Hi, Peter. Let's look at this part 2 with the top 14.
Hey, Peter. Thanks for having me on again. Looking forward to finishing off this list.
So, in our previous episode, we covered a document which has been sent to us by a listener of a ranking of every World Drivers' Champion. We got as far as 14th, and we basically assessed where we agreed or disagreed with each ranking and just gave our overall views on each of those drivers. And so for this one, we're basically just going to pick up where we left off. So we're going to begin in 14th with John Surtees. So John Surtees is an interesting driver because he is the first and only driver to be a world champion on both 2 and 4 wheels. He's very well decorated in motorbikes. He's won 5 or 6 championships in a lot of races. Formula One, he got his one title in 64 by a very slim margin. And again, he won it because of the rule about only X number of race results counting. If every race counted that year, he would have lost the title to Graham Hill. So yeah, in terms of his statistics, definitely the lower end of the rankings of F1 champions. But clearly a very versatile driver.
Definitely. I think part of the reason why Surtees is so high here is probably to do with that MotoGP legacy he also has. Winning, I think, 7 championships over there, and being obviously the only driver to win on 2 and 4 wheels in F1 and MotoGP. I think if we look at it from purely his F1 career, ranking-wise, I may have to disagree with him making it into the top 15 because, like you said, although he was quick and had some good races in him, Clark would have won if it weren't for the whole drop rounds thing F1 used to have.
Hill.
And I feel like he's more in here so high on merit of how good he was everywhere else rather than just purely focusing on F1.
Yeah, I see that. Having looked at the slides that were sent to us, I can see that actually the maker of the slides just looked at his F1 record, which is interesting. So he talked about how he was much faster than Lorenzo Bandini, and also how he was not that far off Jim Clark in most of the races. So that's also interesting because, yes, Surtees came into F1 from motor racing, but he instantly adapted. Like, he placed second in his second F1 race, then took pole position in his third race. That's extremely impressive. And I think that's what really made him go so high into these rankings. I definitely wouldn't agree with him being 14th. But, in this ranking, there are a lot of things that seem to be taken into account. There's the technical feedback, there's the attitude. For some reason, the attitude of the driver seems to matter a lot. And the maker of these slides said that Surtees could have broken into the top 10 had his attitude not been fantastic. Even as a team principal, when he had his own team, Surtees in Formula 1 and Formula 2, most of his drivers complained about him. And in 1966, a lot of people think that Surtees and Ferrari could have won the title if he had not left Ferrari following a disagreement with the staff, because in 1966 he wanted to be the lead driver at Le Mans during the first stint, and he just wasn't given that, and he left Ferrari both for sports cars and in Formula 1 at the same time. So yeah, it's interesting. He seems to be held in very high regard by whoever made this, and I see some points that go towards this, but top 15 is too high for me.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is the motorbike stuff, because if he'd never done any of that, he wouldn't be remembered nearly as much. Because just for comparison, he's got 6 wins in Formula One, but he's got 38 in motorbikes, and he went 4 years in a row winning every race he entered. So you can see why he's so well remembered for that. But just in terms of Formula One, it's not quite the same level of acclaim, I think, and achievement.
Yeah, another thing that seems to be important to the maker of these slides were teammate comparisons. And Surtees was much faster than Jochen Rindt when they were teammates. And obviously, in the previous episode, we looked at how fast Rindt was. That seems to have helped Surtees a lot in the rankings. But yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting that he was 14th in this.
So in 13th, we have Keke Rosberg. So Keke was one of the characters of the 1980s, obviously known for the moustache and being a chain smoker. He had a lot of attitude on track as well. Very fast, very aggressive. He got his 82 title, although that was a very strange year when almost anyone could have won it. But despite the fact he was known for being undeniably fast, and he held the average lap speed record for 17 years, the results don't really show that so much because he has just 5 wins. He's finished runner-up a couple of times, but yeah, so he's somebody who is often rated higher than his career record would suggest.
It's interesting because Keke Rosberg, again, going back to like these rankings in 13th, I would imagine that you two are also going to say this, but I think it's just a touch too high. I know, obviously, he joined that Williams team when they were a bit newer into F1. They had the one championship in 1980 with Jones, then Jones retired and they brought in Keke Rosberg. And then he did win with that team that I think it wasn't as strong as you saw Williams. If you, for example, the 90s, Williams were a lot stronger than they were in the 80s. But the season is overshadowed by the fact that we lost Gilles Villeneuve and Pironi had his injury. So it kind of took out Ferrari from the equation that year. Whether that would have changed anything, it's another one of those what ifs. It feels like throughout this ranking, we've done a lot of what if. But to have him in 13th ahead of some of the other drivers that we've seen, even like, for example, Lauda, who was in the top 20, I would immediately put above Keke Rosberg. So be curious to see what you guys think on that as well.
Yeah, as you said, it's interesting. And again, I want to ask the question, are we looking at the driver's championship winning season, or are we looking at the entire career? Because if we look at 1982, well, yes, it's impressive that he won in what was not the fastest car, but we all know why he won. But if you look at his entire career, and I think that's what put him in that place of 13th, he outperformed Fittipaldi in the same car, he outperformed Lafitte in the same car, he beat Mansell on points, I think, in 1985, and for the maker of these slides, the most impressive feat was outperforming Carlos Reutemann by a lot in qualifying, when Reutemann was known to be quite good and quite complete in both qualifying and race pace. So I feel like this is why he's 13th. Now, should he be there? I'm not sure, because you cannot just look at, you cannot just look at those stats, and you also need to look at the bigger picture. Yes, Keke Rosberg was very fast, and all of his peers seem to be saying that. Alain Prost also credited Keke Rosberg a lot for his championship win in 1986. But if you look at his achievements as a whole, maybe his attitude and what you need to be an F1 champion or an F1 great, I'm not sure he had that. He was a superstar, and he was maybe one of the first modern superstars. As Dan said in a previous episode, the 70s, the 80s are when we started really getting Formula One superstars. But in terms of pure racing, I'm not sure he cracks into the top 15.
I think it's curious because it brings us back to that point that we had when we were talking about James Hunt, where maybe in this ranking, it's been heavily weighted towards pace and what drivers can do. But then we talked about, well, is that what the only thing that makes up an F1 driver? And it isn't. I mean, you look at Lauda, he was never considered the fastest driver of them all, but he was smart. His feedback to the car was very important. He was good at that. And he was just consistent for a long period of time in F1, which to me, I think having other qualities, not just being quick on pace, is what makes an F1 driver go from good to great.
Yeah, I think what's kind of what damages his results a lot is because he was racing in the 1980s when the cars were extremely unreliable, and his very aggressive driving style really did not help them when you had these turbo engines running at high temperatures and high pressures. To not really let off is not going to help them. And this is shown by the fact that the sheer number of retirements that he's got to his name, especially in '86 when he was at McLaren and he was a teammate to Prost, and Prost won the title. Complete opposite driving style to him, would nurse the car much smoother, very good on tyres. Whereas Rosberg got one podium and a few points finishes, but lots of races where he never finished in what at the time was was a very reliable car. So he's someone who was one of the ones that had just kind of blinding undiluted speed, but wasn't really well rounded enough to be able to sustain championship battles. And yeah, the '82 one, he ended up being largely consistent by getting one win and several other podiums, but a lot of the reason he won that title was because of the losing the two main Ferrari drivers and just it being such a chaotic year.
I looked at the public opinion of Keke Rosberg, both at the time and also by modern fans who are also into the '80s. And they either say that he is a contender to be one of the best 5 drivers of the 1980s, or that he's kind of the Jenson Button level of driver where you have a lot of feats in terms of stats where, Button did beat Lewis Hamilton in a season, Button did beat Alonso in a season. You have all these stats in terms of teammate battles, but in the end, no one regards Button as a great. And yeah, I just wanted to ask both of you, would you regard him more as a top 5 '80s driver or more of a Jenson Button, very good driver, but just not that level?
I would say personally, I couldn't put him in the top 5 of the '80s. Thinking of who you've got there: Senna, Prost, Piquet, possibly Mansell. It would be a tough crack to put him in the top 5, but that's not to discredit him and say that he wasn't good. I just don't think he had all of those qualities that for me make an F1 driver really magical. He just had a lot of speed and he had some good luck in the end.
Yeah, I think for the 1980s, top 10, absolutely. I mean, I'll be able to think about this more because at some point I will have to do a video ranking every driver in the '80s. I get the comparison to Jenson Button in terms of his results. Obviously, in terms of his personality, in terms of his driving style, nothing like Jenson. But yeah, in the way that got his title when he was good, he was excellent, but just wasn't excellent enough of the time. That just wasn't consistent enough to always deliver. In that sense, it adds up. But it's just he's one of the last drivers to have so few wins and be a champion. Just 5 career wins. When by this point you had drivers that had 20, 30 career wins. It was back in the 50s and 60s when you had that little. So he's one of the last of those ones really. But going on to P12 and holy recency bias Batman, it's Nico Rosberg. This is an interesting one. You have to give him credit for 2016 is that even though he needed a lot of things to fall into place for him to finally beat Lewis, but he did everything he needed to do and he left no stone unturned. People like to say, oh, he retired because he knew he couldn't beat Lewis again. And maybe that was true, but obviously he did have his family. And for some drivers, winning one title is enough and that's all they want to do. And then it's time to bow out. Yeah, I think for me, generally, I would say before he moved to Mercedes, he was a very good midfielder. He was very promising at Williams. Obviously, he beat Schumacher, although Schumacher wasn't exactly in his prime. Excellent technical understanding, one of the most well-educated drivers we've had in Formula One. And I think, to be honest, the biggest compliment he received as a driver was to be succeeded by Bottas, because Bottas made things very easy for Lewis.
Yeah, I agree with you. Rosberg is a very hard one to place in these rankings because one thing we have to consider, and we will consider it for Schumacher later, is how we view Schumacher's return to Formula One in 2010. Because if we see Schumacher in 2012 as one of the very best drivers on the grid, as the maker of these slides does, then yes, Nico instantly gains like 6 or 7 places here. If you consider Schumacher to have not gone back to his 2006 self and he's still good but not quite a top 4, top 5 driver on the grid, then instantly Rosberg goes down. So This one is very hard to place. Beating Lewis is very commendable, as it will always be, but we have to consider that he put everything aside to focus on that year. Another thing I saw is that Nakajima on this slide is presented as a future Super Formula champion and a 3-time Le Mans winner. Yeah, you can't really use that because Kimi beating Giovinazzi in 2020, well, on that slide, it's not said future Le Mans winner Antonio Giovinazzi. So, yeah, Nico, I think, is a bit underrated by fans in general, but he's not underrated by these rankings. And personally, and I'm looking forward to what Peter thinks about that, I would actually rank him quite similar to where I would put Vettel.
Yeah, I'll just say quickly that being a serial winner in a Toyota hypercar when there were no other hypercars is not the flex you think it is.
Especially when 2 of those were with Alonso as a teammate, which I think helped a bit.
Yeah, this there's not going to be any debate between us three that this is too high for Nico Rosberg. Yes, I look to rephrase. I absolutely commend that he could beat Hamilton. The absolute mental strength that he said that took him. How broken he looked after the season. I have nothing but respect for him because that's something I probably could never do in my life, is put myself mentally in that place. So, in that regard, very impressive. But I'm sorry, you're lying to yourself if you think he was up against a Schumacher the same as in the 2000s. You're going to lose pace as you get older. Schumacher had a family. He had other things to worry about. He wasn't the same driver he was back then. And at the end of the day, people have done the maths. Hamilton was the quicker driver in 2016, but he did have more issues, and Rosberg did capitalize on it. Obviously, winning 7 straight races in a row between 2015 and 16 is not an easy feat either. So that's not to discredit Rosberg and say he was a bad driver, but cracking into the top 15 is even probably too much for him. Again, I agree with you, Nav. Putting him somewhere where Vettel is probably more realistic.
Yeah, I wonder if the person who made these slides isn't called Vivian Rosberg, because having Keke in 13th and Nico in 12 makes me think that's the only thing that's going on here, because yeah, there's a Rosberg family fan among us, I think.
So I've looked at 2016. I covered it in a fair bit of detail in my I Spoke video. When it comes to Lewis losing the title, people love to focus in on Malaysia, but he made so many mistakes that year. A lot more. I calculated that he lost a lot more points from mistakes than reliability, and he lost a lot more points from both of those than Rosberg did. So it's not, but and even with the amount of mistakes he made, mostly from botched race starts off at the beginning of the year, Rosberg still only beat him by the thinnest of margins in the end. But speaking of, in 11th, it's the man he beat in equal machinery. This is an interesting one to have Lewis outside the top 10. Possibly more controversial than having Vettel 23rd. This is going to make a lot of people very unhappy because obviously there are a lot of people who think he should be number 1 or at least top 5. But I think maybe if you look at things, if you look at the bigger picture and if you look at what his McLaren years, you can start to justify putting him a bit lower, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I would have him personally just outside the top 5. Again, that's not to discredit Lewis Hamilton. He's an incredible driver, one of the very, very best drivers, the most successful driver. But when you guys are going to see, when you listeners are going to see who are in the top 10, you're going to realize that you do have a lot of people from previous decades who just edges Lewis. Now, Lewis, we need to say that his rookie season, most people might know this, but his rookie season was incredible, but that was helped a lot by 2 things. He had an incredible amount of testing, maybe unseen amount, an unseen amount of testing for a driver who entered the sport after 2000. And the second thing is the tires used in 2007 were very similar to the tires that they used in GP2 in 2006. Now, those are not excuses I'm using as an Alonso fan. Those are just things that you have to look at in the wider picture when considering that 2007 was incredible. Now, all the other achievements that he has accomplished, will always speak for him. That's not going to go away. 2018 was one of the best individual seasons I've seen from any driver. 2020 as well. He was absolutely dominant there. But, there's one thing that always gets brought up. It's that he never absolutely dominated his teammates. And yes, he had better teammates than Alonso and Vettel did. There was no Sebastian Bourdais, there was no Nelson Piquet Jr. It was Rosberg and Bottas. But there was not that edge, that dominance that just defines the very best drivers.
Yeah, Lewis Hamilton 11th. I'm personally as well not really a big Hamilton fan. I know that he has quite a loyal fan base out there, but I would say around here seems reasonable. There's probably an argument. I'm yet to see the whole top 10, so I'm curious to know who's going to be up next. But there's probably an argument for maybe a couple of the drivers that are going to be in there that you could put Hamilton higher, but we'll just have to see. You don't win 7 championships by accident, although the argument is that Mercedes, for that whole era of 2014 to 2020, was one of the most dominant cars and eras in F1 we've ever seen. His McLaren years were impressive, but I think post 2008, you did see a couple of mistakes from Lewis that maybe he's gotten rid of now in his driving. But it's interesting that they did appear then. I suppose he was thrust into the car in a way no other rookie has been. He's been thrust straight into the title battle and just been racing at the front ever since. So he really is a one-of-a-kind case to look at. And yeah, Lewis is an incredibly impressive driver. He's fought amongst the best in F1. But 11th, it's a tough position. I actually think similar to where I would end up putting him.
For whatever reason, at McLaren between 2010 and 12, he was too close to Button. And I know there were a lot of reasons. There were, in 2011, I always say that Lewis was not in a good state at all. The media was all over him for a number of off-piste related issues. But he should have beaten Button by more. And of course, that was probably prime Jenson Button, but he was way too close, and that's always going to sit badly. Same with Bottas in 2017. Of course, he would beat Bottas later on. But yeah, that edge is why he does get into the top 10, absolutely, for me. But top 5, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think everyone understands in terms of statistics, he's the greatest driver because he has most wins, most podiums, most pole positions, tied for most championships, etc. We've all seen what are considered his best drives and how good he can be in the wet. But we need to also look at the fact that he has been involved in a lot of accidents with other drivers. There is a very common tactic of his that we've seen him, tapping the right rear wheel of cars trying to pass him around the outside and putting them into a spin. That's happened quite a lot. But also, he's always been in such a fortunate position because he began his career in the fastest car on the grid, and he was the first driver to do that since Jacques Villeneuve. And Jacques Villeneuve was pretty much the first driver to do that since probably some of the drivers in the 50s and 60s. He's never had to do a sustained campaign in a car that's not capable of winning races or even getting podiums. Because you can point at 2009, that car was bad for the first 8 or 9 races, and then they slapped a double diffuser on the back and he won the next race. And then he hasn't won any races for the past 2 seasons, but the car is obviously fast enough to win it if everything falls into place. It's just that things haven't quite fallen into place, which is why he's had so many podiums and some close calls, but no wins come yet. He's never had to have a season in a genuine midfield car where even just scoring points is a struggle. But when we have seen him in less competitive cars, he often becomes kind of invisible, and we don't see so many of those really dogged drives. You can often see things, for example, Germany 2018, when he comes from far back to win or whatever, is like, yes, okay, he won from very far back on the grid, but in what was comfortably the fastest car and against an incompetent Ferrari as well. And he's had so many races where safety cars have just been timed perfectly, or he's had his other competitors retire because, again, he's often had cars, since Mercedes particularly, he's had a car that's been supremely reliable. And I think his number of retirements in the past 10 years, it's fewer than 10. And most of those are accidents as well. So his cars just never break down. So that alone is helping a lot with this. And this happens with most modern drivers, is that they basically benefit from stat inflation because they have cars that don't break down, and it allows you to pick up several wins in a row in a way that drivers just couldn't do it in the past.
Would you still have him in your top 10?
I think so, because you can't blag your way to 7 titles and more than 100 wins, even if the majority of his wins have been him leading from the front. Because I think about 60% of his race wins are from pole. With Verstappen, it's 50% exactly. With Schumacher, it's about 47%, and then with somebody like Prost, it's 30%. And then with Senna, it's 70%. So that you can see obviously who are the ones that are really good in qualifying. Yeah, you can't, because of how well decorated he is, you can't realistically put him outside of the top 10. But then you can't just you can't pretend that he's had to really struggle that much compared to basically every other driver he's raced against.
And do we all agree that having Hamilton just one spot above Nico Rosberg in this is kind of outrageous?
Yeah, I mean, in the slide, the rationale is that he said they were equal on pace. They weren't equal on pace. I mean, Hamilton was obviously the faster driver. Even for 2016, he was the faster driver most of the time when he wasn't making mistakes. Hamilton needs to be a little bit higher, but Rosberg needs to be a lot lower, I think.
So Hamilton, I guess one of the reasons he's a bit further down here near Nico Rosberg is when he's been put in really close title battles, he maybe hasn't capitalized as much as he could have. So 2007 was close with Alonso and couldn't make it work, lost out to Kimi. Then 2008, he obviously did win that one, capitalizing on the Ferrari's mistakes. But then you go look forward, well, 2010, he probably would have had a chance, but things just didn't work out for him. 2012, I don't think was a chance for Hamilton because he was more clear of Button. But then you go 2016, he made his own mistakes, and that was a close title fight, closer than when he beat him in 2014. So you start sort of looking at some of the times he's got in fights with other drivers, 2021 as well, and you see that Hamilton actually does have a couple mistakes in him when the pressure gets to him.
4 times Hamilton has taken the title fight to the final round and then lost it. So it gives you an idea of how close he's come to being an 11-time champion. And if you look at those 4 seasons, like 2007, that one, still after 16, 17 years, you still feel like he should have won it. Because he clearly got into Alonso's head, and Alonso was not enjoying his time at McLaren. And Hamilton made, the only notable errors he made were basically the Nürburgring and Shanghai. Other than that, he was pretty much flawless, even if he wasn't always the fastest driver. But we had Spygate going on. There's rumors of possible intentional sabotage because of what happened to him in the final 2 races, and Kimi coming back so strongly. It's to lose that you still feel like he could have done it to win the title in his first year. 2010, he was only by 1 or 2 points was he mathematically in contention, but that year there had been several accidents, and the car was on race pace only marginally off the Red Bull, not so good in qualifying, but even Red Bull had a lot of reliability and accidents themselves, which made things harder for them when they should have dominated it. But that one, with fewer mistakes on his end, he maybe could have won it in 2010. We've covered 2016 before. I think mostly a mixture of reliability and errors, but leaning more on the errors side. 2021, that's all on him. People want to ignore just how many mistakes he made. And he got that amazing engine in the last 4 or 5 races, which drew him back in when really he should have been so much further behind because he'd made so many mistakes. And we'd had races like Hungary and Silverstone where things just worked in his favour, or even, Baku and Hungary again, he was given a complete open goal, which he managed to miss.
Yeah, I think in 2021, a lot of people remember the finale and just that insane engine that Hamilton got for the comeback in Brazil and forget some of the mistakes, the prior mistakes. I want to say that in 2007, I really think he was the worthy champion. And I say that because in Brazil, a lot of people forget, he just lost drive for I think 3 corners, and he lost a lot of time there, which I'm sure would have gotten him 1 or 2 positions. So not even talking about Shanghai or the Nürburgring, if he doesn't lose drive for seemingly no reason, for 10 seconds where everyone thinks he will have to DNF, he still wins. So yeah.
So now it's time for the top 10. And first up, we've got Fernando Alonso. This again is a bit of a spicy take because Alonso is somebody who, if anything, compared to Hamilton, he's got stat deflation. Definitely kind of has his results do not do him justice. I think just 2 titles, obviously 2010, 2012, runner up both times. Both times came very close to getting it. But then obviously I've said before that I think that, to be honest, Kimi is the worthy champion in 05. There is a very strong argument to say that Schumacher should have taken it in 2006 as well. But he is just supremely talented. This is the thing about him. He's one of the most naturally gifted drivers we've ever seen, and certainly of the 20th century. I think he's 21st century even. I think he's more naturally talented than most other drivers. And we've seen it in the fact that at his age, how well he's still driving. To be in his early 40s, compared to what Raikkonen and Schumacher were doing at this time, he just doesn't seem to be able to, he just doesn't seem to kind of be able to let off. Even if his main flaws, I find, are that because he compared to Kimi, maybe he cares too much and things get in his head. Also, he's not particularly congenial. He's made some very poor business decisions in terms of teams he's moved to, and if things don't go his way, he tends to complain and just disrupt morale and offend the sponsors and that sort of thing. But when he's on track, he means business.
I'm surprised you say he's not very congenial when he was voted TikTok Personality of the Year in Spain in 2023. That is how I define congeniality. But yeah, Alonso is one of the hardest ones to rank here because someone could put him in the top 5 and you could see why, and someone could put him outside the top 10 and you would also see why. Stats deflation has massively impacted his career, and still I think every Formula One fan or every big time Formula One fan knows that he is a very good driver. Now, what's weird in this list that we were sent, of course, on the slides, Alonso doesn't really get any flaw just mentioned. I was looking at the slides, and yeah, he's praised for his longevity, he's praised for his adaptability. The maker of the slides also didn't blame him for 2007, so I'm not too sure what's going on there. But yeah, Alonso extremely adaptable. I don't want to go too much about him because he's still on the grid and everyone rates him very highly. I would have him a bit higher, but that's obviously because I'm a fan. I would not put him quite into the top 5 because that would be too high, even though I'm sure that many fans feel that way. If he somehow gets a third title in 2024, 2025, I think he just shoots up the rankings.
Alonso is, I'm going to be biased as well because Alonso is one of my favorite drivers. And I think one of the things that makes Fernando so special to watch is that he is very entertaining on track. You see Verstappen when he's out there, let's just take this season, for example, and everything just goes Verstappen's way. It never really looks like he's having to try or think about it. Obviously, he's trying. Obviously, he's working very hard as a professional athlete in a top-level machinery in F1. But when you see Fernando driving and you listen to his radios and you see the moves he's pulling off, he is always so opportunistic and so smart about the way he does a race and how he thinks about the tires and what other people are going to be doing. And that's what I would then boost him up in the rankings, in that not just is he very talented, but he's also just so entertaining to watch that he makes F1 feel quite special when you see him on the TV.
I think 2023 is the best thing that could have happened for him in every single way, because not only have newer fans seen what the older fans were on about when they kept saying, you might not be seeing Alonso perform, you might not even see Alonso in the sport when he took his 2-year hiatus, but believe me, this guy is very good. And all the fans were always just, brushed aside and were like, yeah, we're told, yeah, you're just being a nostalgic fan. He wasn't that good. He only won 2 titles. Whereas this year, him finishing P4 in the standings is extremely impressive. Yes, it has a lot to do with the with the younger drivers not being able to get points where they all should have been performing more. But yeah, the fact he got P4 in the championship this season, and he proved himself again to everyone that he is still relevant, he is still performing, has been the biggest boost he could have hoped for. Now, the issue, as Peter said, is he always made bad decisions in terms of teams. And it's not just bad decisions, it's also decisions that, well, he was forced to make because he had burned bridges, he had just bad relationships with a lot of people. Christian Horner famously didn't like Alonso as early as 2010, 2011. Alonso always says that Red Bull wanted him. Red Bull always says we never wanted anything to do with him. So yeah, this will always be hanging over his head, and you will always be thinking, what if for Alonso? We spoke about a lot of what ifs in this episode. Alonso is the biggest case of it.
Yeah, I used to hate Alonso back like 10 years ago and before, during the Vettel years, because he was his main rival and because he just felt so arrogant and entitled. And I started watching around 07, 08, so the time when he was just past winning his titles. So I hadn't watched any of those, and I knew who he was because they said, youngest champion at the time and everything. Now I quite like him because he's loosened. Well, he's loosened up a bit, and the fact that he's showing he's still got it, because I mentioned at his age to be still driving so well, because 21 and 22 they were by and large fairly anonymous seasons. Obviously, aside from 21, he gave us that amazing performance against Lewis in terms of defensive driving at Hungary, and again we saw that again this year in several examples. And he just felt invigorated to be back in a good car and a good team once again. Because for so much of the hybrid era, his 3 years or 5 years, what it was with McLaren, it was just endless complaining and retiring as basically a form of rage quitting, alienating Honda. It really wasn't helping him. But as part of the stat deflation that I mentioned before, compared to every other champion of his era, he's never had an outright dominant car. That's the interesting thing. Because, for example, 2005, the McLaren was obviously faster. It just broke all the time. 06, it was kind of there or thereabouts. I mean, they had the tune mass damper, but when that was banned, then the Ferrari ended up being faster. 07, again, hardly any difference in the pace on the Ferraris. And then his Ferrari years, when he did it, they were always slower than Red Bull. So he's never had a season like with Vettel and Schumacher and Lewis, blah, 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 where they've had a car that's like a second faster and they can just cruise to victory.
Well, addressing the elephant in the room, do you think it's fair to have him higher than Lewis in this ranking? And this is also the decision that will probably make some people turn off the podcast. But yeah.
In terms of natural talent, yes. And general racecraft, yes. And when I mentioned about congeniality, I was mentioning before about burning bridges and not being very good at making friends in the paddock, rather than his rather interesting antics on TikTok that we've seen recently, impersonating microwave meals and stuff like that. But yeah, that's kind of, whereas Hamilton is more of a team player. He's built even if he has a tendency to blame everyone else when things don't work out or when the car's not winning or something. He is more of a team player and has built a good rapport with everyone at Mercedes. Whereas Alonso, it's just a history of him basically blaming everyone else and quitting teams and then crawling back to them years later and that sort of thing. But in terms of his on-track ability, he has almost no equal.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to say that I would put Alonso higher. And if you were looking purely at stats and figures, and you'd never watched an F1 race, everyone would just call you mad, because obviously Lewis has incredibly high stats. But when you actually watch Fernando, and I think one of the biggest testaments to this is that he himself has said his two best seasons, and he said this year, now it could just be him trying to big himself up a little bit, or it could be genuine. He says his two best seasons he's ever driven are 2012 and 2023. So I think that's just a testament that even though he's never had that dominant car, he doesn't actually regard his title wins as the best seasons. He regards when he himself was in peak performance and putting a car in places it really shouldn't be. And that's the difference we've seen between Lewis and Alonso. Lewis has always had a very fast car and always put it at the front where it should be and took home the title when he's needed to. Whereas Alonso has taken cars that are really not the best on the grid and pushed them to basically just take advantage of every opportunity he can to push them towards the front and be in with a chance.
Yeah, just to close this on Alonso, him saying that 2023 is one of his 2 best seasons is, I think, a classic Alonso move, because he made mistakes that went under the radar because of how good the overall season was. But Las Vegas, he sent it into turn 1 for no reason, and just spun. The Spa sprint as well, it was just a sprint race, but again, useless mistake. Qatar just went off track for no reason. So I think that was a bit of an Alonso move, but yeah, there's no denying that his longevity is not something we will get used to seeing, I think.
So moving on, in 9th we have Alberto Ascari. So he won his 2 titles. This was during the year when Formula 1 was actually set to Formula 2 regulations, which basically just meant the engines were smaller, because back then there was hardly any difference between all the different formulae. But in that time, he won, I think, all but 1 or 2 races that he entered. I mean, his people like to say that he could have had the record for most consecutive wins were it not for the Indy 500. Yeah, his career was cut short by his death in 1955. He certainly could have carried on for a few more years after that, because he was relatively young. I mean, he was in his 20s, I think, at the time, as opposed to drivers like Fangio and Farina being in their 40s. But yeah, it's also a time, it was kind of easier to be dominant back then, because Formula 1 was so much more amateur, and the majority of the drivers you were competing against were amateur drivers. And the range of pace between the cars was colossal. But they did break a lot, and people crashed a lot, and he obviously didn't do that. So you have to give him credit, at least, for being consistent enough to at least finish several races in a row.
Yeah, ranking-wise, Ascari in 9th. I'm not sure if I would put him this high. I think this is where I would push one driver down, maybe, I don't know, towards sort of the close to the top 20, if not in it. And this is where I'd then push Lewis and Alonso a little bit higher. Now, Ascari, like you said, he had that really dominant run with Ferrari in 1952, winning every single F1 championship race except the Indy 500, which is, of course, counted on the F1 calendar. But again, another one with his career cut short, and then there was the dominance of Fangio sort of after 1953 and onwards. And then he passed away. He had that crash in Monaco into the water, and then he passed away at Monza while still recovering, most people think, from those injuries. So it's another one where maybe similar to the Jochen Rindt situation, although we did see a bit more of Ascari, was what could have been. Could he have taken more of a fight to Fangio as Ferrari sort of developed those cars into the late 50s and early 60s a little better? That's a question for you guys and your opinion. What do you think? Do you think if we'd seen more of Ascari, we could rate him higher, or do you think this is a fair ranking?
I think he should be lower, but I also agree that if we had seen more of Ascari, maybe Fangio would not have won 4 titles in a row, because his contemporaries, especially Mike Hawthorne, rated him very highly. They even said he was as fast as Fangio, if not faster. Now, one issue I have with this ranking is, so we're talking about a driver who had an incredibly strong prime, who won a lot of races consecutively, and in the right conditions, especially when starting from pole, was incredibly dominant. Now that for me screams Sebastian Vettel. But Vettel is 23rd here and Ascari is 9th. Even Enzo Ferrari said Ascari was incredibly good when he started from pole, but even when he started from 2nd or 3rd, there was an issue. So yeah, I'm not too sure why Ascari gets the benefit of the doubt to be in 9th, but Vettel goes down to 23rd. If that's just because Vettel couldn't dominate against Lance Stroll, and if Lance Stroll made a 4-time world champion lose 10 places in this ranking, then I'm not sure this is very fair. But yeah, for me, having a Vettel in 23rd and Ascari in 9th for what are, I would say, similar styles of driving and similar types of domination, it doesn't sit right with me.
It's difficult to say if there was more left in the tank just because of his career trajectory, because after he took his second title in 53, he then left Ferrari and went part-time, but he never finished another race again. And outside, he won the Mille Miglia and he won the 12 Hours of Casablanca, but not massively well decorated. I mean, pre 1950s, he had a lot of wins around 47, 48 before we got the official World Championship. But we had, by 54, 55, this is when Mercedes were now in Formula One, and they would be until the Le Mans disaster. And Fangio was really getting into his stride. So it's hard to say, unless he got a seat with a decent team. It's kind of hard to say. But all I'd say is you could at least credit him for consistency, and for Ferrari for building a car that clearly worked and didn't break down all the time.
So, Peter, what would your ranking be of him? Would you put him in the top 20, or do you think you'd sort of move Sebastian Vettel up like Nav said?
For me, Sebastian needs to be top 10. I'd probably just swap them, to be honest. But Ascari 23rd. He just doesn't. People say maybe he was as fast as Fangio. He just doesn't have. He doesn't have the results. He doesn't have the star performances that Fangio has. Farina, maybe you can. I mean, Farina was much older, but you could compare them as well. But yeah, he's not. This is where you get into the tricky things about even attempting to do rankings like this, because you're having to compare drivers from very different eras with cars that were very different, and even the way the races ran was different, because back at this time they were much longer, the circuits were very different, the cars drove in a completely different way. That's where it becomes difficult. And the main thing about him being able to win so consistently was because the field was so much less competitive than it is now, because Formula One was still basically an amateur sport at the time.
That's when I wish that Formula One had gone through different names and rebrandings, a bit like endurance racing has. So then you can actually have a greatest of a specific era, because we then have to personally define our own eras as post 1980s, maybe pre 1970s, because Formula One has been the same sport and has had the same name since 1950. Then we end up having to compare Ascari with Vettel, and there was 60 years of difference. 60 years between their primes. So yeah.
So in eighth, the third and final hill is Graham. I think the main thing that stands out in terms of his accolades is that he's the only driver so far to have achieved the Triple Crown of Motorsport. So that means only driver to have won Monaco Grand Prix, Le Mans, and the Indy 500, I believe. We've had a few drivers that have done 2 of those, but not quite 3 just yet. I think the closest we've seen to that, Montoya has done 2 of the 3. Alonso has done 2 of the 3 as well, and several other drivers, but no one else has quite. No one else has quite managed to do it. And I think these days, with the fact that people don't do several series at once, we may not see anyone else achieve that. But otherwise, yeah, again, a very solid driver. Took 2 titles. Was again known for his longevity, because he had a 17-year career in Formula One, all the way from 1958 up to 1975. During which time the sport had changed almost beyond measure. The cars had completely transformed in that time, and he was able to go with the times. I mean, if you think about Formula One today, 17 years ago was 2007. It's like, okay, there were no hybrids, there was no Halo, no DRS, basic things like that. But in terms of the fitness level and the raw pace of the cars, it wasn't that different. Whereas this, we're going from cars that were front engine and had these very, very thin, spindly tires, absolutely no downforce, to cars that had massively oversized front and rear wings and these big air boxes, and they were starting to actually understand aerodynamics and much thicker tires and much more powerful engines. So that was a lot of change to have to deal with. But yeah, just a solid driver who won 2 titles and came close to winning a couple more. Yeah,
I'm curious as to why he's so high up here, though. Top 10 is a lot for a 2-time champion. I know Mr. Monaco, one of the still even then trickiest circuits, and he did dominate round there. But at the same time, he doesn't stand out as much as some of the other drivers we've mentioned. even from that time period, I suppose you could say an argument could be made for Fittipaldi to be better than Graham Hill, just talent-wise and when he came in. So, yeah, I'm very curious as to why he's so high. He obviously did have a bit of a fall-off in the latter stage of his career, which I assume a lot of people then discredit him for, but that was after a massive accident. So Graham Hill, I personally, again, not one I would put in the top 10. This is where you can move some of the other drivers before that we've said really should be up there. Hamilton, for example, or Vettel, like Peter said. But Nav, what do you think on Graham Hill being this high up?
The thing is, on the slides, again, the maker said that they would put Graham Hill even higher if he had not suffered such a sharp decline. That gives me two reasons why I don't know why Hill is here. Firstly, because I don't see how you could blame a driver for staying in Formula One because they wanted to. That's just a personal preference. It's just a man wanting to drive more in Formula One. I don't think you can blame him for wanting to just race past his prime. So that's one thing I'm not sure should be taken into account to move him lower. And in the first place, I don't know why he started that high, because I feel like there is some bias towards his wider contribution towards motorsport in general, as the only winner of the Triple Crown. Because in Formula One, he wasn't that good. And it's a good thing that at least he's lower than Jim Clark, because I know that some people rate Graham Hill as a better driver than Jim Clark in Formula One, which makes no sense to me. So yeah, I'd have Hill outside the top 10, as harsh as it might seem, because we're talking about Formula One here, not motorsports in general.
Yeah, I think obviously not better than Jim Clark. I mean, he got beaten by them. He got beaten by him several years in a row. His second title in '68, when they were teammates, he basically, as far as I'm concerned, he only won that because Jim Clark was dead. If Clark had lived out the season, he would have taken that title. Yeah, for me, I kind of feel like you could put him in a similarly better than Surtees, but not massively better, just not good, but not as good as other people he raced against, and kind of lucky that different circumstances gave him opportunities to win lots of races and take his titles. But obviously, yes, as I said, Mr. Monaco, I think 5 wins he got at Monaco, so clearly that was one of his better circuits. And yes, very good in winning lots of stuff outside of Formula One, but yeah, just not. Wasn't in that same sort of god tier level as a lot of other drivers on this list.
I think it's similar to, like you said, what we said with Surtees as well was, well, if you look at their wider career outside of F1 and rank them on that, then yes, there's probably an argument for Graham Hill to be up there in the top 10 of sort of motorsport drivers, maybe not top 10, but top 15. But if you look purely at F1, then you can't put Graham Hill anywhere near, because, for example, we had Andretti much further down the list, who was incredible across multiple series of racing and just another one of those drivers that absolutely loved to race, but not necessarily the best in F1, which is why he was so much further down. So if you're going to be doing the rankings, I say keep it consistent. And if you're looking purely at their F1, then Graham Hill can't be this high.
So in 7th is Ayrton Senna. In death, Senna has kind of achieved immortality and taken on this near mythic status. I mean, I've never seen F1 fans wax lyrical about a driver so much as Senna, and constantly parroting something gap something racing driver over and over again. But yes, he did take. He had this sort of near spiritual attitude to the way he would race. It was like, okay, it's just racing at the end of the day. It's just driving a car fast. It's not achieving nirvana or anything like that. But yes, supremely talented. He showed that all the way through his junior career before entering Formula One. Excellent wet weather driver. Even when on the back foot, really put in some of his best performances were when he wasn't in the best car, such as 92, 93, for example, and 84, his first year with Tolman. Yeah, brilliant qualifier, brilliant racer, excellent in the wet, but his conduct at Japan in 1990 is always going to hang over him, I think. That's not how you win a title.
Yeah, Senna's a curious one. I mean, he's definitely in the top 10. I think for every F1 fan would put Senna way up here. So ranking wise, definitely deserved of being here. And the grid as well he was driving with, you have to remember, is one of the we've talked a lot about those drivers in our top 20. Some of the best drivers we've agreed with being highly ranked. So he's racing against Prost, Piquet, Schumacher, even Mansell, who was a bit lower, but there was a lot of extremely talented drivers alongside Ayrton Senna, which I think makes him deserved of being up here in the top 10. Like you said, 1990 it's a tough one because many feel that he deserved the year before 1989 because of the disqualification in Japan, but to then go and do that, it just doesn't feel right. And another question I'd sort of like to pose to you guys is, if he had carried on for longer in F1, do you think we would have seen a sort of decline from Senna? Because he was getting a little bit older in 1994, and people were even then maybe speculating on, does Senna still have that same pace? Do you think if he stayed in F1 a little bit longer, especially with these rankings, would they have ended up actually putting him a bit lower because of a later season he had?
Yeah, so looking at the slides, I saw that 1993, for example, was a criticism for Senna because in 1993, with Michael Andretti as his teammate, who was much worse than Senna, Senna had started to become maybe a bit complacent. He didn't have this same anger and drive that he had when Prost was his teammate. 1994, as we know, he started the season with 3 pole positions. So there is a sign that there was still a will to achieve and a will to win titles. So I think he still wanted to be very fast when he had the cars to do it. But I think after the 3 world championships he won, if you didn't give him a car that would win a title, he wouldn't care as much. He wouldn't be like, your Alonso type of driver who will try to fight your way into P8 or P7, especially when back then it might not even give you any points. I still think we never got the Senna versus Schumacher fight that we all deserve to see as Formula One fans, and it would have really made us understand and know how you rate both of those drivers. One thing I will say is that I am fine with him being just outside the top 5, and that's just a personal opinion, because ranking Senna again is opening this kind of worms in terms of what is important to us as Formula One fans when we do those rankings. If you're going to look at raw pace, Senna could be top 3 even first for most people. If you're going to look at him as a driver in general, then I'm not so sure he's in that top 5. He has been the face of Formula One for so many people because of his raw speed, but that depends on what you as a fan think is important in Formula One.
Yeah, this is a hypothetical scenario that's been discussed as ad nauseum online about what if he'd survived Imola. I think basically he would have stayed with Williams and then retired at the end of 97, because by then he would have been 37 years old. And I'm guessing he probably would have turned his nose up at the idea of the narrower track and particularly the groove tyres and thought, I don't want that. And I've been doing this for 13 years now. I don't need to carry on. And I think, to be honest, 94, we could have had a bit of a 2021 on our hands, because he would have had this young driver who's been here for a few years now and has been, hinting at their potential against the seasoned veteran that has all these titles, kind of pushing each other to their limits. I think that's basically how it would have gone, but I think Senna would have won it because Hill got within 1 point of winning it. And so if he got that close, Senna absolutely could have won the title. Particularly because just before Imola, he told them they'd cracked the code to working out what was wrong with the car, and they were going to bring the upgrades, which they did. And again, 95, who knows? But yeah, it was the better car, so maybe he could have. 96, no question, he takes it. And again, 97 would have been another close one. But he would have had basically this sustained rivalry with Schumacher, which we only got elements of in 92 and 93, when neither of them was in the fastest car, so they were just kind of battling for best of the rest. all I really remember from that time, I think it was 93, they had a coming together in Manicourt, but otherwise I don't remember a huge amount in terms of them competing against one another directly. But yeah, he's just very interesting because of the way he's remembered, and just because of how good he was. Although I will say I do think that Prost was objectively a better driver when you look at the big picture.
Yeah, so obviously we haven't looked at Prost yet, which means he's high in the ranking. But do you think that Senna documentary in 2010 incredibly inflated Senna's view in most people's minds?
It skipped over quite a lot of things, but it definitely presented a very pro Senna narrative. And one of the things that annoys me is that everyone knows about Suzuka in 89 and 90, but there's very little talk about every other race in those seasons. And I'm thinking, okay, so how did we actually get to this position of it being this close? And it's like, and I may be guilty myself of not looking at those seasons enough to see where they had gained and lost points. Because in 88, when he did take the title, that was not a particularly controversial year. And obviously they had an extremely dominant car. But Senna, even with being taken out on the last lap by Jean-Louis Schlesser in Monza, he still won the title, but he'd actually scored much fewer points than Prost, but because they only counted a certain number, so he ended up winning it because of that rule. I think there are a lot of things that kind of look over, because he would have periods of having amazing drives and being dominant, but then he also had long periods where he wasn't in the fastest car and he wouldn't be competing for wins necessarily, and they tend not to get remembered quite so much.
Yeah, last thing on Senna, I think he was the perfect driver for those conditions in the 80s where some races counted and some races didn't count. Because if he was driving erratically and caused a crash or whatever, well, the race just wouldn't count. Whereas nowadays, that's losing 25 points, and that makes you lose a title.
Yeah, and even in 94, had he got up and walked away after his crash at Imola, he still would have been 30 points behind Schumacher already. So that would have been quite a hill to climb, but a hill that I think he could have climbed and beaten him on, particularly if Schumacher still got himself disqualified from 2 races and banned from 2 others. In 6th place, we have Max Verstappen. It's always tricky, I think, ranking anyone that's still racing and it still has quite a lot of years left ahead of them, even though he seems to several times he hints at retiring earlier than many people think he should be. But then we think, to be honest, he's been here for 8 years already. He just finished his 9th season because he started at 17, even if he's only 26 now. He could easily go on for another 15 years, but depends if he wants to. But when he first entered, the first couple of seasons, the main thing I thought was we had such an exciting prospect here because he was so young and experienced and people were very skeptical. But even if he was flouting the rules a bit, he was at least being interesting. And similar to when Montoya appeared on the scene, he didn't care who he was racing against. He would just race them really hard. And he did get involved in a lot of scuffles and has a bit of an attitude problem. He's since mellowed on that, but and as dominant and as flawless as he has been in the past 2 and a bit years, it's been fairly straightforward for him.
Yeah, Verstappen being here, it doesn't surprise me, and I would have him now here for the current state. The thing is, this ranking takes longevity a lot into account, and for some reason takes the latter part of a driver's career a lot into account. So if Verstappen, for some reason, and I don't see it happening, but if for some reason he wanted to join Sauber for 4 seasons, when he's 30 and he gets 5 points in 4 seasons, I feel like this ranking would put Verstappen outside the top 10. I think that Verstappen will retire when he's still in a good car, and we might see some incredible stats when he eventually retires. Yeah, when Verstappen burst into the scene in 2015, he made perhaps the most boring season in the 21st century somewhat relevant because he was not scared of anything. He was trying overtakes where he shouldn't, and you instantly knew there was something going on there. There was a special driver there. And he actually delivered on that promise. Now, will he be top 5 in this ranking when he eventually retires? I think he will, because the level of skill that he's displaying at the moment, I just cannot see him not winning 24 and 25. And I feel like he might genuinely just leave in leave the sport after he doesn't get a dominant car, because he wouldn't care anymore. He would become a team principal and WEC or something.
Yeah, Verstappen is. I mean, the problem is because he's the current driver and stuff. There are a lot of people that like to hate on him for ruining the sport or being too dominant, or whatever. But the fact of the matter is, we have seen this over a long time in F1 of drivers being through dominant phases. And although Verstappen's maybe just the current era lasts a bit longer than it used to, it's safe to say he's been absolutely on top form since he joined F1. That win in 2016 with Red Bull, where there was so much controversy around should Kvyat have been taken out the team for Verstappen. You know, he's still relatively new, and then he just goes on his debut, wins the race, defending against Kimi Räikkönen in the last few laps. I think that just cemented there that Verstappen was something special. And to have as well Niki Lauda say that he's one of the best drivers he's seen in like a decade of F1, Verstappen is just proving that now. And I think, like you said, Nav, by the end of his career, it would not surprise me at all if he's higher up in these rankings into the top 5, because what we are seeing is something we've never seen in the entire history of F1. And he's getting the most percentage of wins in a season, despite there being 14 more races than there was in the 50s. It's just, it is truly, even if you're not a Verstappen fan, it's truly impressive to watch.
Yeah, I've had to look into his races a lot for my next video on my channel. And the more I look into him and remind myself of some of his earlier performances, the more I start to think we're looking at like a god tier level driver here. Because racing was already in his blood. Obviously, his father is Jos Verstappen, who was a bit of a journeyman in Formula One, but obviously that's you have that heritage. And then maybe he was questionable on how he did it, but Jos was basically, he was like a cyborg that was programmed for racing, Max, because his dad was instilling it into him from when he was very young. And yes, he could be very tough and very harsh, but it clearly worked because he had just, he hadn't even finished his first season in single seaters and he'd already got a seat with Toro Rosso. And you look back and you think that is just utter madness. Nobody would have done that before since the 1950s. When you think most other people spend at least 5 years in single seaters before they move up to Formula One. But he just, in terms of his driving skill, he has almost no blind spots other than possibly defensive driving. That's maybe the only thing I could still say that's weak, because he used to be quite a bad qualifier because it took 5 seasons for him to get his first pole position. And now he's got however many it is, more 30 or 40 at least pole positions, and is known as one of the best qualifiers. He just, yeah. I mean, obviously, a lot of people won't like it. They don't like anyone who dominates. I mean, 10 years ago, everyone hated Vettel. Now everyone loves him. Hamilton didn't. He made a lot of enemies when he was winning all the time. Max is doing the same, mostly from Hamilton fans because they don't like the fact he's beating Lewis. Maybe over time he will, and he can have an attitude problem, but all the dominant drivers are like that. They get in their heads, they get angry when things don't go their way, and he's no different in that regard. And maybe in later years he'll mature a bit and lighten up, and particularly if he does have to spend some years in a less dominant car. But there's no reason. I mean, okay, I'm not going to turn this into a 2024 predictions, but I think he's going to cruise to a very easy 4th title this year. And it's definitely possible he could overhaul both Michael and Lewis's points win tallies as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of people forget 2017 and 2020 for Verstappen. Those were incredible years in a car that was far from the fastest in both seasons. Verstappen delivered when he was 19, and then he was in his 6th full season, but he was still only 22, I think. So yeah, he has always delivered. And one thing I will say is that we have been looking at some drivers on this podcast fondly, because in the 60s they were dominant, in the 70s they were dominant. Oh, look at him, he had 70% wins in his year. In 20 years, people will be doing the same with Verstappen. They will not have seen any of the races live. They will not have, witnessed the domination, but they will be looking at those results. So it's a bit unfair, I think, for people to be hating on Verstappen for being so dominant now. But when we look at Jim Clark and Ascari and Senna, we're like, oh, this is amazing. Well, we should be looking at Verstappen the same night.
Yeah, I think one thing that you can't accuse him of, that people like to accuse Vettel of, is lost. They would say about him, they would incorrectly say, he can only race from the front and he can't overtake and do that because he never won any races outside of the top three. So yes, he never won from any lower than third on the grid, but he did have races such as Germany in 2019 where he was started last and finished second. You can't accuse Verstappen of that same thing because he has won races. I mean, in 2022 alone, he won races from 10th and 13th. He has one of the largest ranges of positions he's won races from. He's actually, I mean, just looking at a table I've got, he's won from 9 different positions on the grid. So he's tied with Alonso in that respect and has more than Schumacher, Hamilton, Vettel, Prost, Senna, everybody else. You wonder, maybe we'll see a race where he can start from last and finish and win it. Even Russia 2021, he started last and finished second. It's just hard. Yeah, he just has yes, he's got the fastest car, but he's just able to just deliver so consistently and make no mistakes. I mean, this year was the closest we've seen to any driver being flawless ever, I think. Or I say this season, 2023. And there's no reason to say he can't achieve even more in the future.
Just to finish on Verstappen, would you put him 5 spots above Lewis Hamilton, both of you?
Maybe not 5, but I think he needs to be higher. Maybe only by 1 place, but I think he does need to be higher.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. I think if we take we've said Ascari and Hill are going to be lower for us. So if we take those 2 out, that would leave Fernando in 8th, Hamilton in 9th. That's 3 spots. Maybe that's more reasonable. So if we are taking Ascari and Hill out, I think then that could be more reasonable.
So in 5th place, it's Michael Schumacher. This is another controversial one because Schumacher is he was the sort of OG just dominant driver. He's him and Lewis are the 2 names that everyone thinks of, even people that don't watch Formula One. When you say Formula One, he just became this complete superstar athlete. He was the first billionaire athlete. He raised the game in so much in terms of the fitness requirements to drive in Formula One. It's as dominant as he could be. He is marred by his conduct at Adelaide 94, Jerez 97, Silverstone 2000 was it, and Monaco 2006. Is that he wasn't above essentially cheating to get what he wanted, but he's just you just can't not look back in awe at what he did with Ferrari in the first half of the 2000s.
Yeah, I think we go back to this question of Formula One having eras with Schumacher because he is just not a driver who was in the same sport as Jim Clark, for example. But yet, you'll have loads of people saying Jim Clark is the greatest of all time. Some will say Fangio, some will say Verstappen, some will say Schumacher, some will say Lewis Hamilton. And, you can kind of see it because it has been such different eras for the sport that it's not even the same cars at all. It's not the same engines. It's not the same aero. So Schumacher is definitely up there. I would put him as top 3 for me. Perhaps higher, but at least in the top 3 because, as you said, you say Formula One to anyone and they say Schumacher. He was one of those first.
He's the face of the V10 era. Yeah.
Yeah. He's the face of the V10 era, but he's the face of old Formula One for most people. Most people who didn't watch F1, you talk about who's the face of Formula One, they will say Lewis Hamilton, and then you say who before that, they will say Schumacher. As simple as that. Now, one issue there is with Schumacher is that during his era, there were not drivers who were as impressive as some of the other names we have looked at and we will look at. That period between 95 and 2005, there was Mika Hakkinen, which we saw was not a driver who lasted long enough, who had a very good prime but didn't last long enough. David Coulthard, less said the better. He was just not at that level. And then you had a young Kimi Räikkönen and a young Fernando Alonso who were coming through the ranks, coming through the F1 echelons. And technically, you look at Fernando Alonso, the first time he had a proper shot at the title, he did win. Schumacher wasn't up there. And then in 2006, the first proper one-to-one battle we had, Schumacher lost for whatever reason that was. So I think that's the only reason that he's not quite top 2 for me, but he's still such an important figure for the entire sport.
Michael is deserved of top 5. Possibly, like you said, I'm looking at a couple of names a bit higher, but again, it's going back to the problem that we keep mentioning, which is how do you draw a comparison between someone in the 1950s to someone who's racing in the 90s and 2000s? It's reasonably impossible. The thing with Michael, he did also have the one thing, I guess, to play devil's advocate to maybe why he's 5th. He did also have everything that you kind of could ask for as an F1 driver. Benetton era, I think, was his own merit, definitely a lot of his skill. But when he was at Ferrari, he was clearly the favored driver. The team was his dream team of people he wanted to work with in F1. And then the entire mission was just get Ferrari back to the front, win the championship. Michael and Brawn, you guys are in charge. Do what you need to do to make this happen. And that's when you go, well, would Irvine have been the name that brought Ferrari the glory again if it hadn't have been very one-sided in favor of Michael? Would Barrichello have had more of a chance? He was a very good driver in his day. And obviously in 2009 came within reach of the championship. So I guess you could argue that during the later phase of his career, the bit everyone remembers at Ferrari, he did have a lot of good things fall into place for him.
Yeah, and going back into this issue of not having a lot of opposition, I mean, Heinz-Harald Frentzen, Jenson Button, Jacques Villeneuve, Damon Hill, again, David Coulthard, that was his opposition. Ralph, his own brother, who was always prone to mistakes, that was his opposition. And yes, he dismantled all of them. He deserves credit for it. But there was not that same issue of having strong competition as we discussed for drivers of the 80s, of the 60s, or even of the 2010s.
Yeah, if he was 10 or 15 years older, he would have had a much harder time because he would have had to been competing against peak like Senna, Prost, Piquet, Lauda, drivers like that. And some of those he did compete against at the very beginning of his career. I mean, he was even teammate to Piquet for a few races in 91, and he did have a couple of years against Prost and Senna and that. But yeah, for most of it, he found himself in a period where either all the best drivers are gone, or there were some drivers which we thought were going to be good and then just weren't, like, you know, dare I say, Jean Alesi. And then drivers who were at the very beginning of their careers and were just starting to get going. So he didn't, yeah. And again, in the modern era, would it be the same if he was having to compete against Hamilton, Leclerc, Verstappen, Sainz, drivers of that caliber? But even so, I think
you did put Sainz into this list, which is quite funny. But keep going.
I was just trying to think of drivers quickly, and I was like, I'll just say Sainz. But yeah, I probably should have said Lando or Piastri, but whatever. You get the point. I think the main reason that even since we've had, the main reason people have been reticent to put him as the best driver ever, even before we had the likes of Hamilton and Verstappen appearing, is because of the races where he was basically playing very, very dirty tactics. That's always going to be a stain on his reputation. That combined with the fact that when everyone thought, oh, nobody's ever going to achieve what he did, and then Vettel, Hamilton, and Verstappen all have done, shows that he's not so unique in that regard. It's just now living in an era where you can have a car that is both dominant and reliable, which means you can win so many races.
How would you have judged Schumacher if he beat Montoya that actually cared about Formula One?
Well, okay. I mean, I'm not a huge expert on Montoya. I didn't know if it came across he didn't care. I just know that his career obviously didn't go the way it was meant to go. I mean, Montoya, I've said it before, he was similar to Verstappen because he just came in like a wrecking ball when he joined. But Montoya, I think, to be honest, the biggest hindrance that Montoya had was BMW engines that like to blow up. It wasn't so much his driving going things wrong. It was more that at the time, Williams just, even if they had a car that could be faster in a straight line and often had these insanely powerful engines, they couldn't make a sustained challenge against Ferrari because Ferrari's car was just really, really well balanced, and it had a good balance of grip and power and reliability, and having two fantastic drivers and a very well-oiled team that knew exactly how to run strategies and make the team work, even if it was always in Schumacher's favor. Yeah, it was just having everything fall into place how he wanted it, but you have to give him credit for basically facilitating that by building this team up from the ground up and making Ferrari great again when it hadn't been since, well, the 1970s before he came back.
What would you say in 1999 Ferrari intentionally sabotaged Irvine so Schumacher would be the first champion with them instead of Irvine?
I've covered this on my iceberg. I think there is a case for that because they still won the constructors title. But the drivers, yeah, I think that probably was part of the plan, is that Schumacher's meant to win it. Irvine as a champion, it just rubs me. It really does. As much as I would have loved to have seen it, it really does rub me the wrong way. The idea of Eddie Irvine being a champion, considering that he would have won the title and then gone to Jaguar right afterwards. It's just like, no, this is completely wrong. I mean, obviously, I have to. Everyone should commend Irvine for doing a fantastic job in '99. He was never meant to be fighting for the title, and he came so close to it. Even if Hakkinen was being useless for a lot of the season and just throwing wins away left, right, and centre. But yeah, Schumacher. It's obvious that without his broken leg, that would have been an easy title win for Schumacher, and we'd be looking at an eight-time champion. Again, very close to 9. 2006, I'd need to look at this one closely, but the two things that stand out in 06 would be, okay, he sabotaged himself in Monaco because he tried to stop Alonso getting pole and then gets sent to the back of the grid, even if he did manage to finish 4th. Again, that's one of his best drives ever. He did crash by himself in Australia, and then he had that famous retirement in Suzuka, which basically sealed the title for Alonso. But you could make a case for him winning it in 06.
I will always say that in 2006, we should have had the actual Alonso win from P15, because I think Alonso started in P15 or P14 in Hungary in 2006, and he was in first after like 20 laps after overtaking 10 cars on the opening lap. So we would have had an actual win from P15, but then he DNF'd after, I think, a tire was loose or a wheel
nut came off. Yeah,
so a wheel nut came off. So I always say that with regards to Schumacher crashing in Japan and how the title fight could have kept going. The second thing is, we've discussed this before, but I want to know Dan's views on this. What do you think about the recent claim that has been going around Reddit and just blogs recently about how Schumacher could have been leading the 2012 championship after 8 races had he had more luck and also just better pit stops, I think?
Seen like hints of this one. I've not actually properly looked into it, but the thing that always gets me is I think 2012 was a good year for Schumacher. I think he started to gel with F1 again. It seemed like, from what I remember, he had a podium in, was it Valencia that year? That really stands out. But I don't think he was ever in contention for the title. He didn't have the whole package anymore. He had other priorities, and F1 was, I guess, as Kimi Räikkönen would say, it was more of a hobby for him, I suppose. And I don't think he had that full commitment to even really want a title. He just wanted to help his Mercedes team out and sort of have a last glorious run in F1 and for the fans more than anything. And no, I don't think he had a realistic shot at the title that year.
Yeah, I hadn't watched Formula One. I'd watched very little of it during the original Schumacher years, and I remember the hype was just off the charts when he told everyone he was coming back, because everyone just wanted to know, does he still have it in him? And then there was also a lot of the drivers were excited because people like Hamilton and Vettel were like, well, now I get to race against Schumacher. And so everyone was just really excited to see what was going to happen. And then it got into the midpoint of the season. Everyone's like, he's not dominating in the way that we thought he would. And the car, not only is he not dominating, he's being beaten by his teammate. And so then it was like, okay, I think he's past his best. And like 2011, he was closer to Rosberg, and he was fighting for the win towards the end of the Canadian race, and that just didn't happen. And then 2012, okay, we had some odd flashes. So we got the podium in we got the podium in Valencia. We got the pole position that wasn't to be in Monaco. He nearly finished second in China. There was the fastest lap in Germany, but other than that, he had so many crashes that year. I really don't see how people can make a case to say that, he could have won the title in 2012. It's similar to the people that have made the rather dubious claim that the Williams that year was a 2012 car, a race-winning car or a championship-winning car. It was just that it was being driven by two really, really bad drivers. And it's like, no, it's not. It's not nearly that bad. The drivers are not nearly as bad as people make out. I mean, yes, okay, Maldonado got a win and he had a lot of crashes. Senna was at least reasonably consistent, showing that it was basically just a midfield car and they got lucky in one race. But I wouldn't, and you can see by the fact that you wouldn't build a car that could win the title and have it bookended by two absolutely awful cars that struggled just to score a single point. So moving on from Schumacher, in fourth, it is Jim Clark. So again, Clark is another one where it's difficult to compare to the modern era because it's such a different type of racing. Again, in his prime, completely unstoppable. Just cruised to the titles in 63 and 65. Had lots of really, really stellar performances. And again, he was racing every single weekend. He did loads of other things. I mean, in 1965, he won 4 separate titles in different disciplines. Just another one of his, someone, just a real star of his generation that really, really stands out.
Yeah, so around fourth as well, I think, is somewhere in this top 5 has got to be Jim Clark, because even if you think to testaments of other drivers in that era, like Jackie Stewart, they held Jim Clark in such high regard. Like, he was just insanely quick, and not just in F1, like you mentioned, across multiple different series. A 3-time Indy 500 winner. He won Le Mans, I think, twice. So Jim Clark is just on a different level in the 1960s. Again, it's where you go, well, how would you ever compare Michael Schumacher in 5th and Jim Clark in 4th when there's such a big difference? I guess another question is that these rankings have looked a lot into longevity, but they haven't also considered what would happen if drivers' careers were a bit longer. And obviously, Jim Clark had an accident in a Formula 2 race, and that cost him his life. So, Nav, you've been studying the slides quite a bit. Do you think, again, would this be one where maybe the ranking goes up or down depending on latter career?
One thing that brings him down is the fact that he was not a good development driver, and especially in that time, 50s and 60s, drivers were engineers, mechanics, they were everything. They were the complete package. And it seems like Clark was not well regarded in that view. There's a damning comment by his former manager, Scott Watson, who said that if Clark had left Lotus at the end of 1960, no one would have ever heard of him again, because he was never going to bring a car up the field, maybe in a way that Surtees did, or some would even argue nowadays Kimi would. He wasn't a great development driver, and this seems to be the reason why he's not in the top 3, when I think most people would have him as an easy contender for top 3. He would even be the first driver mentioned in the top 3. Now, his Formula 1 career was incredibly dominant, and he probably could have won more titles and would have won more titles. But this statement by his former manager does just keep coming up in my mind. The fact that if he leaves the team, we never hear from him again. It's just so different to some other drivers. For example, Schumacher, Senna, they all really made themselves known with lesser known teams. So even if they started from nowhere, even like Alonso and at Minardi, they really made themselves known for their input or for their pace. So just the fact that his own manager said that he could have just gone under the radar is quite major for me.
I think his lack of technical understanding was basically compensated for by the fact that Colin Chapman was a genius and was basically delivered over a 25-year period. He basically single-handedly brought every major revolution and invention in car design to Formula One. So he had some very competitive Lotuses, even if they were quite fragile and quite dangerous, and obviously one of them ended up killing him. An interesting what if is to see how he would have adapted to wings, because he died just before Lotus introduced them, and this is the beginning of cars actually having downforce rather than just needing to focus on having good suspension and tire grip and having a low center of gravity. And you wonder if he maybe could have adapted so well to those. But he's one of these kind of drivers who, and I think because of his origins, he was a farmer. He didn't start out as a mechanic or an engineer or anything like that. He was one of these ones where basically he would have had the attitude of put me in a good car and I'll drive the socks off it, and he certainly did that. I think a good measure of this, and because I've got a future video trying to look at every champion's best and worst race. A good measure of a driver is how easy it is to find a bad race, and with him, it is not easy. Like there are some drivers you can point at. It's with modern ones like Vettel, Max, Lewis. Most people can list at least half a dozen howlers of a race performance from them, but with Clark, it's really, really difficult to find a bad race.
Yeah, the slides seem to suggest that Chapman was perfect for Clark, because Chapman was a former driver and also a very good developer, as we know. So it was perfect for Clark. Clark would just give very abstract views of what he needed, and then Chapman would make his magic work. So it's interesting to think about what would have happened if he left Lotus at the end of 1960.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you mentioned that Chapman was working with Clark, because obviously, like Lotus in that era, we already touched on it in the last podcast, but they were very innovative compared to a lot of the other teams. And again, if you look through his racing record across the other series he would enter, I mean, the Indy 500, for example, he would win those again with Lotus cars. So even if he wasn't that full package, which is something we've also touched on through the rankings, is, well, what actually makes an F1 driver? Is it just raw speed, or is it having good engineering feedback? Is it having a smart racing style and being clever? I think, again, no one driver will ever tick every box, but Jim Clark used his strengths and then backed it up with his team of having Colin Chapman and good engineers around him, where if he has a weakness, well, other people can cover that for him, and he can then play to his strengths, and that's what allowed him to be so dominant.
Yeah, he's somebody who, if he was alive now, because he wasn't well-rounded, he maybe wouldn't be quite so good because he wasn't well-rounded enough. It wouldn't be enough to simply do, I suppose, the Charles Leclerc approach of give me a good car and I'll drive the socks off it, as opposed to the Carlos Sainz approach is I'll do my own setups, I'll tell you where to go with directions, and I can work out strategies. He was just kind of in the right place at the right time, and obviously it was a very unique position to spend your entire career with one team, even if his career was ultimately cut short at the end. But yeah, so top three, and in third place is Jackie Stewart. I'll be honest, this feels a little bit generous. When it comes to Jackie, most of what people remember is his campaigning to get improved safety in Formula One. That's usually the thing that comes to mind. Even though he did win 3 championships and was always a prominent and very good driver through his whole career. I mean, to win 3 titles at a time. I mean, he broke both Clark's and Fangio's records for most race wins. Before that, the only other, there was Brabham he was tied with Brabham on 3 titles, and then Fangio had 5. Really high accolades. But yeah, I think most people will remember him for his efforts to improve safety.
Stewart for me is a really cool one, because although third, again, like you said, in my opinion, is a little bit too generous for Stewart. That's not to say he wasn't also extremely highly regarded and had some really good seasons. I would actually want to look at the seasons where he wasn't winning. So it's 1972, it mentions here on the slide as well, that he got a stomach ulcer and was ill, and that led to Fittipaldi playing catch up and winning. But again, then when he left in 1974, it was like a hole had been left in F1 because he was just so clear of the other teams, and he was just such a well-rounded and good driver that he was so confident in being able to be faster than everyone else's peers that in 1974 it felt like a competition of who's going to come up to the mantle to replace Stewart. And obviously from there, I guess the case could be made louder in 75, sort of stepped up to a similar role. But Stewart was incredible. And you have to think about the caliber of driving he was racing earlier in 1969 with the likes of like Brabham still on the grid, his main rival being Rindt, who we've talked about being extremely fast. So he was shining and dominating in an era where it wasn't easy to do that at all.
Well, one thing that really stood out for me in the slides was that Stewart has been credited as having what remains the best rookie season in Formula One. What do you guys think about that? So in 1965, Stewart in a BRM finishes third in the standings, wins the Italian Grand Prix by, I think, 2/10 on the line. First was Jim Clark and second was Graham Hill, who were in their own class, some could argue, during that era. So would you say that he is actually the driver with the best rookie season in Formula One and not actually Lewis Hamilton in 2007 or even some say Leclerc in 2018?
Yeah, Leclerc 2018, we can't take that one seriously, I don't think. If you put a gun to my head, I think I probably would just say Lewis 07, even if you could also say, you could even say Villeneuve 96 or possibly Senna 84. If you're feeling really facetious, you could say Farina 50 because he won the title, even though he wasn't a rookie in quite the same way. Yeah, I mean, a very good debut season, but not the best. At the end of the day, he's someone, again, when I think of him, I don't know a huge amount about his racing. That's the problem. Like, I can't think of many races that stand out. I mostly know him for wanting to get, seat belts and better helmets and more robust fuel tanks and just better marshalling practices and stuff like that, and Armco barriers and all his work to improve safety, and the fact that he had so many drivers that were close to him that died during his career. That's mostly what I remember him for. And the fact that he's the oldest living champion, so he has that sort of patriarchal kind of figure attached to him as well.
I find it pretty strange, actually, that how little Jackie Stewart is ever really mentioned nowadays in F1. Like, you'll see him floating around the paddock every now and then at races still, and it's almost like he isn't given enough credit for who he actually is. Obviously, he was massively important in safety for F1, but I think also from what I've read, obviously I wasn't alive to watch it, but from what I've read about Stewart from books and stuff, he does seem like a driver who his peers also saw as just absolutely on another level. And maybe he isn't given the complete credit for that, because similar to what we had with Schumacher, where it's on that transitional phase of some of the greats of one era are getting towards the end of their career and starting to finish, and some of the greats of the next era aren't quite in the sport yet. So he sort of is brilliant ahead of a lot of other drivers, I guess, with his closest rival being Fittipaldi, but maybe doesn't had that circumstance, where he could fight against drivers who were just a little bit lower than his level. And
another question. So Stewart, people might forget, but he retired much earlier than he should have. He retires after winning the 1973 title in quite dominant fashion. He doesn't compete in the final race of the season because his good friend and his protégé, François Sévère, dies. Do you think he goes on to win more titles? And because in the end, he only raced in 99 races, and he still held the record for most wins in Formula One for 14 years until Alain Prost eventually beats it. Do you think Stewart wins maybe a fourth, maybe a fifth? Because he decides to retire at the end of 1972 because he realizes that he's racing way too much. In the Beyond the Grid podcast, where he talks about his retirement, he says that his wife had counted 57 drivers that he either raced with or holidayed with who died and that had disgusted him. So do you think he would be much better remembered if he stayed in Formula One? And also, that might explain why he is a top 3 driver in this ranking?
Yeah, I mean, he went out in a quite heroic manner, I suppose, rather than just waiting until he was past his best or had a useless car and quitting. But yeah, I think 74. I'm sure if he'd with Tyrrell, he probably could have taken the title because again, Jody Scheckter, who was still very young at the time, did really well that year. Beyond that, to win any further titles, he basically would have had to have moved to Ferrari, possibly in place of Lauda. He wouldn't have. He would have really struggled if he just kept staying with Tyrrell to win more titles after that. Maybe he would have given up by, say, 78, 79 with the dawn of ground effect. And by that point, 13, 14 years in the sport, maybe by then he would have called it quits. And he would have been pushing 40 as well. So yeah, there's room for a 4th title, certainly. I'm not sure beyond that, though.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with, I think 74, Stewart could have won. We saw he was faster than Scheckter the other years, so it's safe to assume he would have been continuing. But then, yeah, like you said, Peter, from then he would have to have gone to Ferrari, potentially McLaren. But the thing with Stewart is, and the thing we've seen with a lot of these rankings, is that he's very high in here at the moment. I think we've all said we would push him a touch lower. It's another one of those drivers where their career finished early and then they didn't have that sort of trail off. Whereas we've seen that criticized in some of these rankings before. So I think, Nav, you touched on it. If Stewart had stayed in longer and maybe stayed with Tyrrell and not seen success, it could have meant that, at least in this ranking, the way they've done it, he's actually been pushed down a little bit more. And it's only kind of because he went out on a blaze of glory that he's been rated so highly.
Okay, so second place now, it is Alain Prost. There is definitely a case to have him ranked second, maybe not first, but top 3. There is a case for Prost, I think. People will obviously the first person they'll compare him to is Senna because of their rivalry and years as teammates, and because they had very different approaches. Obviously, because Senna really fast in qualifying, really good race pace, and Prost would usually sacrifice qualifying pace for race pace and was more interested in consistency than just going for the win every time. It's how he got the nickname the Professor. He had an amazing technical understanding. He had a 13-year career. The cars transformed massively and he was able to adapt with them. He came within, I think, 10 points of winning 8 titles. So he was always a contender and always present. And he's criminally underrated because of the sort of the religion of Sennaism.
Yeah, I completely agree. That movie, that documentary on Senna in 2010, I think it damaged Prost's reputation so much for casual fans. And it took so long to really just resolve itself, if it even did, because for so many people, Senna is still viewed as much better than Prost. Prost was not the symbol of speed like Senna was, but Prost was absolutely everything else, and he calculated everything. He said that a lot of what he learned about, caring about points and caring about championships was from being Lauda's teammate in 1984, where he only lost by half a point because that's what Lauda did. Lauda focused on points and Lauda focused on what would get him the championship, whereas a younger Prost was still very focused on speed and impressing. So I always viewed Prost as a top 3 driver, and I can totally see why he's second, and I actually agree with that view. Some might see that it's a bit too high, but at least personally, I think it's fully deserved because he was incredible, and being that close to being an 8-time world champion in that era of competition and just unreliability as well, it deserves full credit.
Yeah, I agree with actually this ranking too. I think Prost being in the top three is reasonably fair, and it goes back to what's been a bit of a theme where we've been discussing with some of the drivers on here, like Hunt, especially. We said, I think the first one we were talking about it was you need a driver to have the full package. They can't just be speed. They can't just be qualifying. It needs to be race pace. It needs to be managing. It needs to be thinking about the entire championship and being clever. And that does some Prost up. And like you said, Nav, when you're coming into F1, I think you hear about Senna more. You hear about him being the great of the late 80s and early 90s. And Prost is always just overlooked as like his rival, the person he was racing against. But then when I got into looking into it more, and I think when other people do as well, you start to realize that actually Prost was just as good, if not better in some ways. And that's what made that era so special, was because they were pushing each other to their absolute limits. And it was a battle of wit against speed, a battle of strategy versus power. So, yeah, I imagine watching F1 back then must have been just absolutely exciting. The only thing you could really knock Prost for is that last 1993 championship. Was it more him just joining the right team, right time when Mansell retired? And I think there's a case to be made that had Mansell stayed with Williams, that 93 championship would have been his too, because they really defined the active suspension. But it was also just, a last hurrah for Prost. So curious to know what you guys think of that. But other than that, yeah, definitely a deserved top three.
I mentioned in the first part of this that Mansell, in his autobiography, which he wrote in 1995, just after he'd retired, he said that basically, as far as he was concerned, he'd done all the work at Williams and Prost just reaped the benefits. But Prost, yeah, it is one of those years where you feel like it was like, again, 23, 2011, 2002, where everything is just set up and then he's not really competing against anybody. But interesting enough, because he's been on Beyond the Grid twice, and the second time was just about 1993, and he was saying he actually really didn't like that car because it was a complete odds with his driving style, and he didn't like the extremely narrow setup window that you had to use on it. And despite that, he still comfortably won the title and took several amazing wins in it. But he preferred the more old school cars with the manual gearboxes and the passive suspension and everything else that he could really tailor to his liking and have more feel for.
Yeah, obviously we're not talking too much about junior careers because we're talking about drivers who don't even need that mention to even consider their greatness. But his junior career was just incredible because he just discovered karting when he was 14 in a family holiday. So if he hadn't apparently been convinced by his mum to just have a go, he never tries karting, and we might never have seen one of the absolute greats. And then he wins French Formula 3 on his first season, I think, winning all but one race. Then he wins European Formula 3 twice, I believe. And at that point, everyone wanted to sign him, and he chooses McLaren, which is kind of insane. And I'm sure Peter can develop on this because it's on the unreliability of the Renaults. But if those Renaults were a bit more reliable, he could have easily won 1981 and 82 as well.
Yeah, I mean, 82, it gives you an idea of just how inconsistent that year was for everybody. That in terms of his results, from 16 races, he got 2 wins, 2 seconds, a 4th and a 6th, and he still finished 4th in the title. Whereas if you did that, say, this year, you'd finish maybe 10th at the most with those kind of results. To have so many races, to go on a run of 7 races without scoring a single point. But yeah, Renault did pioneer bringing turbos in, but as the first people to use turbos, it usually meant that theirs were the worst ones, and everyone just improved on it because they were notorious for just always breaking down. And even after 6 years of doing them, they still had that problem. But yeah, just another one I mentioned before is just how, like I said, that Lewis has finished runner-up 4 times and done so in the final race of each season. With Prost, he's done the same thing, but it's even closer. And you just look at how close he could have won to got to winning 8 titles. Because I think in my video where I converted every season's results with the modern point system, he then takes 7. So that gives you just an idea of, yeah, basically how good he was. Right, so number one, only one driver left to cover, and it's Fangio. This is one, obviously, some people may disagree, but this is one I think a lot of people would agree with. Again, it's the eternal question of how can you compare him to Hamilton or Schumacher? But you can compare him to his rivals, and they were just absolutely nowhere. Nobody, even Ascari, achieved such a sustained level of dominance and had such a high win rate, and just did. Again, he was one of the first drivers to have like a fitness and dietary regimen and really think consciously about that. He would come to races early, like weeks in advance sometimes, to acclimatize to them and get used to the climate and everything else as a way of preparing himself. Yeah, just really, really well rounded. Obviously, he had some time off because of injury, but for the most part, kept himself out of trouble. And as I mentioned with Clark, the measure of a driver is if you can find any bad races, and finding bad races with Fangio again is almost impossible.
To go back to I guess playing devil's advocate a little bit, because I know if you kind of go to general F1, if you were to say scroll the surface of Twitter on F1, Fangio is not most people's number one greatest driver. So in order to play devil's advocate, I guess the main argument that you can use against Fangio is who was he actually racing back in the 50s? You think 50 and 51 to sort of 55, he's racing Ascari, he raced Farina and lost out mostly due to reliability in that first season. Once Ascari passes away, does he race Sterling Moss for a little bit? I'm not sure if
they were teammates.
Yes, he does race Moss, which again, Moss is a really good driver. Then I'm not sure from past Ascari though, just how competitive the field was until you start to get more towards the 60s again, because you have a few drivers that come in and you sort of recognize the name, but they passed away after a little bit, and that would be the only criticism I could give Fangio. Other than that, he's absolutely astounding for the period he was racing in and the amount of championships he got with different teams, and being able to get 5 championships in that era. No one could do that again until Schumacher in the 2000s. So that just shows you how impressive he was for the 1950s.
I always say the fact that he won 3 consecutive championships with 3 different cars is absolutely unreal, because yes, the driver and the driver mattered more at the time, because the driver was kind of the mechanic and the engineer at the same time. But the fact he won back-to-back with Maserati, Mercedes, and Ferrari, it's incredible, because you haven't had a closest feat to that until Alonso not winning in 2007 with McLaren and missing out by 1 point, because no other driver has done that since, and I doubt it will happen in the future as well. And you need to remember that in 1950 he should have won the title, but there is very wide acceptance that Alfa wanted Farina to win in Italy just for the full Italian outlook of Formula One. So we could have easily been looking at a 6-time world champion here. And well, firstly, there's a Netflix documentary that I recommend everyone who wants to know more about Fangio. I always say that his biggest win is the fact that he lived until I think 1995, in an era where everyone was dying. Absolutely everyone, nearly everyone was dying when racing. He managed to win by a big margin in a dominant fashion and still know when it was the time to stop driving and care more about his family. I think that's just incredible.
Yeah, I found a video. It was from the late 1970s. They got him out in one of his Mercedes from the 50s to do an exhibition run against I've forgotten who it was. It might have been Andretti in a modern F1 car. And he was still racing properly, and he was trying to get past him in this much slower car and like power sliding through the corners on this small track in Australia. And by this point, he was in his 60s, I think, and it's like he's still got it in him. But his longevity is quite remarkable, because if you look at the other champions from the 50s, so Ascari, he died in 55, Farina in 66, Hawthorne in 58. and then Brabham in 2014. So those are the only two that really actually had any longevity from that time. And there were other notable drivers from the 50s, such as Fronin Gonzalez, Jean Beira, Luigi Musso, and some of those were maybe just not quite on the same level, or they were killed and didn't see out the end of the decade or whatever. But yeah, he just had, for the time, he had the complete package. And obviously, you have to give credit to basically anybody that was driving that time to be able to do so confidently. Because now, like with the modern drivers, every so often they'll be allowed to drive a car from the 80s or the 90s and they'll love it. But they've all said they're not going to go anywhere near the cars from the 50s because those things are just death traps.
Yeah,
And yeah,
it's
he just
interesting because at Silverstone 2011, I remember Alonso driving the 1951 Ferrari, and because of the 60th anniversary of something, and Alonso was late to the drivers' parade by like 5 minutes because he was meant to only do one lap, and he ended up doing 2 laps just because he wanted to. So they were pointing towards the pit lane, and he wanted to, and he was praised at the time because, as you said, most drivers did not want to get anywhere near those 50s cars.
Yeah, I went to that race and I was sat at Beckett's and he was like power sliding through Maggots and Beckett's in that car. I remember that quite vividly, actually. But yeah, the others they don't want to touch them, and I don't blame them because those things are just, you see, ignoring the fact that if they did wear helmets, they were made of cork. They didn't cover the face. They didn't wear fireproof overalls. They had their sleeves up, and they've got their elbows leaning out the side of the cockpit, right next to this massive exhaust pipe that would have been red hot as well. It was just, yeah, it was just insane, really.
One last thing on Fangio that I love, and I love the same, and I love Sebastian Loeb in Rally for the same reason. In 1958, so Fangio had retired at the end of 1957. He decides to enter the Argentinian Grand Prix just like for a final adieu to his home fans. Gets pole position with a privateer by 6 tenths, and you might think, oh, maybe 6 tenths isn't a lot back then. Second, third, and fourth all, I think, qualified with 142.6. So it was quite tight, and he just does a 142 flat. So that's how much he could have dominated if he just wanted to. Just like Loeb, the comparison is because after Loeb retired, I think he came back 2 years later just for one race, and then he won, and then he stopped again. So yeah.
I think the thing with Fangio as well is I know what video you were referencing there, Peter. I saw it as well and ended up scrolling through the comments a bit. And one comment that stood out to me was, I think the engineers before or something had said to him, look, it's just a show, like, don't go properly for it. And he went, we're racing drivers, put us on a racetrack, we're going to race. And I think in that sense, he was a bit ahead of his time because he had such a professional racing mentality that every F1 driver is expected to have now. But you look at a champion like Phil Hill, I think he's quoted as saying that he didn't even care about winning. He just, because he felt bad beating people. Whereas Fangio had that proper mentality that you need in F1. I think that's why he was ahead of his time, and therefore that just brought him such success.
Yeah, another thing about his legacy and longevity I'll mention quickly. My favorite photo in Formula One history is from the Bahrain Grand Prix in 2010 because it was the 60th anniversary of Formula One. They got every living former champion except Raikkonen and Piquet to come to the race, and so they all posed together for a photo. And that photo alone is amazing because it's about 25 drivers and it covers every era of Formula One all together. And they did exhibition laps in their championship-winning cars. Everybody except Brabham because he was in his 80s at that point, but even Surtees still went out in his old Ferrari. But yeah, in the 20 years before that, for Formula One's 500th race, they did a mini sort of reunion at the Australian Grand Prix, and they got 7 ex-champions together, and Fangio turned up for that race. And the picture, he sat next to Senna, and Senna is like holding his hand up in the air, and he was 80 years old at this point and had been out of Formula One for over 30 years. But he was still so kind of remembered and acclaimed in many ways. It's just it's one of my favorite images from a kind of F1 history perspective.
Well, I think that concludes our analysis of these rankings. So why don't we just look at the 5 drivers who are the worst placed for us. 5 drivers in this list that should definitely not be where they are. Maybe they should be higher or lower. Yeah, Dan, why don't you start?
Okay, having a think, I got to think back as well to to the last episode. Having a think, I think Vettel immediately, because we've mentioned him so many times, he needed to have been higher. Looking into the top 10, 2, I think we all agreed on. So I think good shouts to move down a little bit. We said Ascari and Hill just shouldn't be in the top 10. And then I'm not going to count it as my moves, but that pushes, I think, Alonso and Hamilton closer to where they should have been. And then I think the last one is going to be, for me, Nico Rosberg will have to be a little bit lower, because one championship and equaling an older Michael on points, beating an older Michael on points, it just isn't impressive enough for the top 20. And then one that I'm desperate to see higher up is Niki Lauda, because everything about him was so impressive. So if I'm using 5 movements, it's got to be those 5, because Niki Lauda, I just need to use it on, because he's so impressive, and just the way he thought himself through races, the way that, even if you've watched Rush, and I know it's just a film and everything, but the way he could understand the car just by driving it and looking at it, and his mechanical knowledge, it just impressed me so much.
I know that you've been quite fond of Fittipaldi from, well, the former episode we've recorded together, but also this one. Where would you have Fittipaldi then in a ranking?
So currently he's 27th. So having a look at some of the other drivers, he has to go ahead of Hunt. I think he would just about make it ahead of Lauda. So I would say that 21st spot for Fittipaldi. He's not quite top 20 of all time, but he is good enough to be sitting on the fringes of it and ahead of some of those other drivers that have been placed ahead of him. I think it's a bit criminal, a couple of those that have gone in front of Fittipaldi.
Yeah, trying to kind of revise the list and think where would I put everyone else. It's difficult, but off the top of my head. One thing I can do at least is attempt to say what I put as my bottom 5. So I certainly think, for me, the worst one is definitely Phil Hill. And then I would have Mike Hawthorne. I'd put James Hunt, then Damon Hill. After that, it's tricky, because part of me says Rint, but then I'm also thinking like Jacques Villeneuve is one you could throw in there, or maybe even Denny Holm. But I think Phil Hill, Mike Hawthorne, James Hunt, Damon Hill, and then Jacques Villeneuve, I'd say, would be my bottom 5 for drivers.
And who would you definitely have higher?
Vettel needs to be higher. Button needs to be higher. Kimi needs to be. Hakkinen a little bit, I think. Those are the main ones. It's the higher up it gets harder to move them, because there's the 2 real howlers in the top 10 for me are Ascari and Hill. Because if you displace those, so then that moves up Hamilton and Alonso. It's like, okay, that's a pretty reasonable top. Okay, maybe not having Nico Rosberg 10th, but otherwise, that's a pretty reasonable top. That's pretty reasonable top 10. You could move them around a bit. So, for example, I think Jackie Stewart needs to be below Schumacher and Clark, possibly below Max as well. PK needs to be brought in closer. I think Jody Scheckter needs to be lower. So does Rint. Lauda needs to be much higher, and Vettel needs to be much higher as well.
Would you swap?
Would you still just swap Nico Rosberg and Sebastian Vettel, as you said earlier?
Something to that nature. Well, I'd move it at least so that Vettel is above him, but I think Vettel needs to be higher than 12th.
Would you have swapped as well? You mentioned like Niki Lauda. If you're putting Ascari and Hill out from 8th and 9th, and that moves Rosberg to 10th, would you then swap maybe Rosberg and Lauda, or Rosberg and Vettel, so that they get that 10th spot?
Yeah, one of those two. It's kind of forcing me to just make a ranking on the fly. I mean, I have considered in the past doing a ranking video of every champion, but that's basically me trying to say who I think is the greatest driver ever. And all you're ever going to do if you make a video on that is just create a lot of enemies. I mean, a lot of people never forgave me for ranking Rosberg above Alonso when I was, and Verstappen in my ranking every 2010s driver video that I did a few years back.
Yeah, I haven't. I unsubscribed and I haven't come
Yeah.
back. So.
Yeah, it's one. It would take if I was going to try and really be very as objective as I could be. It would take a ton of research and to try and make it fair and reasonable. But I think when it comes to the best, the only two drivers that I could realistically say were the best in Formula One were Clark and Fangio.
Generally, I would, if I ever made a list like this, I would have a top 5 without any rankings. And the top 5 would be, well, the one it is here, but replacing Stewart with probably Senna or Max. And yeah, I'm putting Max already there because I'm pretty sure he's gonna be there at the end of his career. But I would just put in a top 5 in no order: Fangio, Prost, Senna, Clark, Schumacher, and just leave it there because I feel like it's so hard to just compare those 5. It's hard to not have those 5 as your top 5, honestly, but just comparing them is nearly impossible. And then yeah, Vettel, even me hating him in 2010 and 2012, I would have never put him in 23rd under James Hunt. I think that one is the maddest one of the bunch.
Goodness. So yeah, after all that, I think that brings this one to a close. It's a lot to think about, and there's a lot of data to take in to try and determine who is better. And you can see with each of us, we're kind of struggling in that we can making comparisons against contemporary drivers is easy enough, but when it comes to trying to compare ones that never race together, it really is difficult because there were different qualities and properties that kind of made the driver in different eras.
Yeah, I fully agree, and that's why I would never have a ranking for a top 5. As I said, I think it's too hard to rank them, and yeah, I feel like that should be a norm. People who try to compare Clark with Senna, you're just trying to compare drivers from 2 completely different eras where a driver just was not the same thing.
It's just apples and oranges, isn't it?
Yeah. It's not like football where you're just you can't where the ball changes changes a little, but otherwise everything is the same. Like it's a very different kind of sport compared to others because of the nature of having the cars change and stuff like that. But yeah, thank you to Nav as ever, and to DanNoSkill for joining us once again. Your social media following is actually by far the largest of the three of us, but where can people find you if they want to find your work?
Yeah, they can mostly find me on YouTube. That's where I try and do most of my stuff. You might have seen me in shorts before, shouting at you, trying to get your attention. I also do stuff on Instagram and a little bit on Twitch too. So those are the main couple places you can talk to me. And thank you for having me on again. It was an absolute joy to go through all of these champions. You kind of end up remembering little facts about them as you go along, which is fun. So yeah, it's been really cool to be on again. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for joining us. You've been listening to the DRS Train podcast. You can find us on YouTube and Spotify, and we're on Instagram and X at DRS Train Podcast. Make sure to join us for our next episode. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next time.